Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We're a free, pluralistic, and transnational university founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub in Amsterdam. I am Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, and we're having I believe, our last lecture pretty much today. So I would like to welcome our researchers. To anyone that is watching this video, we kindly ask you to support the University of the Underground by donating, so we can pay our lecturers and keep doing these incredible programs. And today we have a guest we've been waiting for the last month to have with us, and even Auguste is a doctoral candidate at the Fordham University, specializing in forensics. His research focuses broadly on the impact of racial trauma on young adults of color and justice-involved adolescents, as well as focuses on general mental health advocacy in Haiti. As part of his forensic training, he has done assessments and mental health work with incarcerated and institutionalized populations. Even has won various awards like the Santander International Internship Fellowship and the Distinguished Speaker Award from the Haitian Apostolate for his clinical and research endeavors in Haiti. So, Ivan, I think that your lecture is going to be very enlightening for a lot of the projects that we are conjuring in the program. So please, the stage is yours.
Of course, no, thank you so much. I didn't know I was getting everybody at the last lecture, so everybody's going to be tired. So everybody here better wake up. I'm expecting questions and communications and whatnot, because that makes it more entertaining and fun for me.
Yeah. We can have conversation. People, I mean, I don't know how you want to have it, like to wait for questions at the end or to have a back and forth.
Yeah, no, so I'll move through my piece.
Okay.
And yeah, I think at the end we could move through it.
So around 40 minutes talk, and then we jump into a conversation. Fantastic.
That sounds great. That sounds great. And just as another caveat, as Nahum knows, I've been working on my dissertation, so not operating on much sleep. So you're getting really fresh from the head. All right, this is just coming straight at you. So I hope, again, it's like valuable. I hope it's enlightening, and I hope it's a fun conversation, right? That it can really interact with the ideas that you're working through. So as was mentioned, right, I'm currently a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology. I'm receiving my training in forensic psychology. I'll actually be completing my degree at the DC Superior Courts next year. And before hopping into the overall topic, right, which is Haitian Vodou and how that's influenced our understandings of mental health and how it can continue to influence our understandings of mental health, I want to share a story about the current state of mental health care, psychology, and psychiatry in the U.S. at least. And to do that, I want to share, a story that I've experienced in some of my clinical work. Right, so, and I'm changing the details of this individual to de-identify and to keep their personal lives private. So around, I want to say prior to the pandemic, this was, I want to say mid 2019, I was asked to do a forensic evaluation for an older woman, an African-American woman who had been incarcerated for, at that time, about 27, 28 years. So at the time, as long as I had been alive, which was kind of like jarring for me, right? Reading through her files, there was a lot of evidence of significant trauma, right? She had been, beaten as a child. She'd been beaten in her relationships, experienced severe and sufficient abuse, right? She repeatedly tried to go to psychiatric hospitals, psychologists for mental health care, and they tended to dismiss her problems. They thought she was acting up. They thought she was fabricating, most of her symptoms, until around, I want to say, her late 20s, right, where when you read through her files, right, it starts to look a lot more like the psychiatrist would note ideas around psychosis, right? Ideas around, oh, this person is talking about seeing things, this person is, you know, this person is interacting with things that aren't there, right? Ideas around what we might call hallucinations and delusions of that nature. Unfortunately, at the time, due to severe stress, she was on trial because her stress culminated in an incident in which she killed a child. She killed a child, right? On the stand during the trial, she was tried and she was assessed by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist assessed her psychiatric symptoms, and despite the fact that there was copious notes around, psychosis of some sort, the psychiatrist arrived at the fact that, oh, this person is fabricating their mental health symptoms. And the person was convicted for 28 years to life, right? Because all of her mental health problems were dismissed. They were seen as fabrications. When I interacted with her for the first time, this was over 2 decades later, she'd been incarcerated and had been forced to endure the abuses of the American, right, jail and prison system. There are instances of sexual assault, there are instances of, interpersonal abuse. Meanwhile, you're losing people on the outside. And as I'm talking with her, my goal is to show that this person is no longer dealing with any sort of like mental health problem, which is in and of itself a very difficult thing to ascertain and to find when somebody's been forced to, again, endure that type of sufficient abuse. Talking with her about the psychosis, talking with her about the symptoms that she'd been experiencing, what kind of came out was that, oh, I had a partner who engaged in Vodou. I had a partner who came from the Yoruba tradition and believed in Vodou. And when I would talk about these practices, when I would talk about these things to my psychologists, to my psychiatrists, they would say it was psychosis. And sure enough, when I was assessed for psychosis, it was said that I was faking. Because there was a lack of understanding around African spiritualities and African traditions, the entirety of her mental health profile was dismissed and seen as fake. And because of that, somebody that was struggling with a severe history of trauma, a severe history of abuse, right, was incarcerated for over 2 decades, despite the fact that she had tried to seek out mental health support. There are notes, again, of psychiatrists saying this person is fine fabricating and dismissing her, despite the fact that she tried to check herself in for mental health support, right? So I was the first person, I was a student at the time, and I'm still a student, to actually ask and interrogate, what are the beliefs that you're talking about when they qualify these as psychosis, when they qualify this as schizophrenia, what are you actually talking about? We were able to talk about her experience with her husband's religious practice, how some of it scared her, how some of it she began to believe in, how she often thought about that. And this was what she was talking about when they diagnosed her with like a schizophrenia that they then want to say she was fabricating, all based in a level of ignorance around African spiritualities and African religions. Now, to zoom out a little bit, that is like extremely common in the American mental health structure and mental health system. If you look at the rates of diagnoses around what we call, again, psychosis, when I talk about psychosis, I'm talking about things like schizophrenia, things like schizoaffective disorder. Black people in the US tend to be disproportionately diagnosed with that, as opposed to maybe more affective disorders, maybe more like a bipolar. And a lot of research and a lot of certain psychiatrists and psychologists who write on this say a lot of that comes down to a level of cultural schism, not like a diagnostic schism. It's a level of cultural schism. What is believable to the person that is interacting with that patient, with that client, with that person? And when people start to espouse, when people start to discuss certain ideas, certain beliefs that are out of touch, out of step with what's been normalized, what is seen as healthy, you start to put all of that in a bucket of delusion, hallucination, and a lot of the times that can come with indefinite institutionalization and confinement. Again, for further context, the main arm through which people tend to receive mental health treatment in the US is through the jail and the prison systems. And so because of this, right, there's this call to decarcerate and decolonize how we do mental health. Because currently within the US, so much of it is through forcing people into hospitals that often don't consider the person's sociocultural context, don't consider the culture that people are coming from, that they believe in, and that their mental health is mapped onto. I was actually doing a lecture, I think about a couple months ago, with a woman named Bhargavi Davar. If anybody has the time to look at, I mean, I wish I had the links. Maybe when we're talking, I can throw some links in the chat so everybody can do some further reading. Bhargavi Davar, she has a Bapu Trust in India. It's kind of again, a decolonial understanding of mental health. She was talking about how it's actually a blessing that they have somewhat less mental health infrastructure in India because they don't have to grapple with this level of incarceration in response to people that are struggling with mental health problems. And so I say all this larger context, right around like the larger problems of how we understand mental health, because there has been a movement and there's a history of what's been called ethnopsychiatry, right? What's been called decolonizing psychiatry and psychology. And a lot of that, like the idea that you have to do mental health work, you have to consider the psychology and mental health and mind of people within their cultural context, that stems in a very strong way from work done in Haiti. And so I want to take a step back so we can actually get to the heart of what we're talking about, right? The role of Haiti, Haitian Vodou, the mind and mental health. So to understand where I'm going with the link between Vodou and mental health, you also have to understand the story of Haiti. Just quick raise of hands, because I've been like, not everybody's heard of it. Does anybody know where Haiti is? Does anybody know about Haiti? I'm getting some head nods. It's cool if you don't. This is what the lecture's for. G said, somewhat, a little bit. Okay, so cool. So again, backing out, right? So when Christopher Columbus, right, arrived, that's the whole American narrative, is that he quote unquote discovered America. That's been complicated, but where Christopher Columbus actually landed was on Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, which was populated by Taino peoples, right, in the late 1400s. Colonized the land for Spain, and later, sorry, I have a little bit of a allergy, so if you hear me cough, that's what that is. Colonized the land for Spain. Later, half the island was ceded to France. This half of the land would become Saint-Domingue, which would be one of France's main exports for sugarcane. Over the decade, over the next century, several centuries, enslaved African people from Western Africa, from Central Africa, were kidnapped from there, brought to Haiti to work. At the time, it was still Saint-Domingue, to work the plantations, to enrich, right, the French colonists at the time. What happened among those enslaved peoples was the beginning again of like a incredibly, I would describe it as a revolutionary reconstruction of personhood and spirituality, right? Among a group of people that had their humanity stripped from distinct, places, from different cultural traditions, seemingly disparate cultural traditions. People began to take, right, their shared understanding of the world, their shared understanding of the spiritual matrix that they found themselves in, and began to interweave them into a more complex fabric that enabled everyone to share this kind of common understanding, this common humanity, this common framework, right, spiritual understanding of the context that they were in. This would be, again, like laying the foundations of Haitian Vodou. You had people that were coming from present day Benin, Nigeria, Congo, Togo, all these areas coming together and combining, right, their spiritual nations. The ability to do that was, again, key and central to the success of the Haitian Revolution, right? One of the only successful Black slave rebellions in the history of the world. The revolution began, a lot of people rooted initially in a ceremony that occurred at Wakaima. Where it actually began somewhat is with Francois Macandal. He was a Ougan. I believe everybody had a lecture somewhat on some of the basics around Haitian Vodou. I think there was somebody, a presenter who, so I'm gonna use some of these terms, and if you're saying like, what is that? Throw it in the chat, raise your hand, I'll adjust and define as I'm going. Francois Macandal, who was a Ougan, who used the understandings of Vodou to begin to coordinate and collaborate with other enslaved peoples to slowly overturn distinct and certain slave plantations. Eventually he was captured and killed, but the entire idea was that through Haitian Vodou, his spirit, his revolutionary energy lived on and guided and continued to live with the people as they continued to revolt. The ceremony of Wakaima, again, a Ougan by the name of Dutsi Boukman and a Mambo by the name of Sio Fassima conducted a ceremony that launched the Haitian Revolution proper, the one that was eventually successful in liberating the country. So Haitian Vodou was, again, like this revolutionary framework that allowed people to form these more than just inter-ethnic solidarities, redefine and re-understand their personhood. Right. And so from that specific day, there was a very specific, very concentrated effort prior to that, and as it continued, to then demonize and subjugate and remove Haitian Vodou as a consciousness, as a religion, as a philosophy for understanding the world around them. The US at large, the Europe at large, there was a concerted effort again to dismiss the new country of Haiti. And you can look, as you look through policies, you can see the Catholic Church conducting very severe, very concentrated anti-superstition efforts to dissolve temples of worship, to kind of castigate and harm people that were practicing their worship. President Elie Lescaut actually again, this was the early 1900s, also kind of conducted his own anti-superstition campaigns, again, based on the idea of anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness. The idea that the ideas and the beliefs that we have as African peoples are what link us to savagery. These are the things that are preventing us from ascending into personhood, as opposed to the anti-Black racism being practiced by the world at large at that point. Because of that, there was a very significant schism in Haitian identity, the desire to be seen as human, to be seen as a person, to be seen as a nation by the neighboring European countries and in the US and the larger Caribbean and Latin America, and the idea to conserve the revolutionary ideas and spiritual framework that got them to that point. And so around the early 1900s, late 1800s, you had a philosopher. There was a very concerted effort. I'm going to locate it right now within a particular philosopher by the name of Jean Mars, who wrote Ainsi par la honte, in which he was an anthropologist, a philosopher. He described the unique, rich Haitian identity as one that combined its African roots with aspects that they had learned and values that they learned from the French colonialism, that you couldn't separate the two as much as people might want it to be one or the other, that you had to hold all the complexities together. So he was one of the first philosophers as a part of the French Negritude movement to really elevate Haitian Vodou, not as just a superstitious belief of peasants, but as a rich cultural kind of masterpiece formed by the Haitian people that had allowed them to assert their personhood and identity on a global stage. He gives birth to Louis Mars. Louis Mars, his son, goes on to become Haiti's first psychiatrist. So Louis Mars was raised with an understanding of a more socio-cultural, anthropological understanding of mental health. At the time, this is a very novel approach because psychiatry and psychology is still being guided a lot by the ideas of colonialism, the ideas of African minds as not rooted in any type of awareness or consciousness. You could look at the work of Carl Jung, for instance, who kind of rooted the idea of a global unconscious within Africa. When he wanted to understand what does it mean for the mind to be unconscious globally, what is that? How do we understand that? He went to Africa and saw that as a root of the not conscious, the unconscious mind. And so Louis Mars contended with this, right? He was a part of a group of decolonial thinkers, the most famous of which I would say is Frantz Fanon. If anybody hasn't read Frantz Fanon, I really recommend Black Skin, White Mask and Wretched of the Earth. But Louis Mars took that approach to his psychiatric practice in Haiti. And so when he arrived back in Haiti from his studies, psychiatric studies, he found that the bulk of what was going on in terms of diagnoses and mental health was done from that colonizing framework. And so you had people shoved into asylums, right, with no hope of treatment, with no hope of recourse, based on flawed understandings of the Haitian culture, based on a demonic understanding, based on a subhuman understanding of Haitian people and Haitian culture. And so Louis Mars took it upon himself to really interrogate this rich history of Vodou and see how can we understand, how can we root these people within their cultural context in order to actually produce health, like one that centers their personhood, not one that sees Vodou as another symptom of mental illness, but understands this is a healthy minded work that is operating within a cosmocentric world. When I say a cosmocentric world, I mean one that lives within a spiritual framework. What does it mean to conduct therapy, conduct psychiatric treatment from that context, as opposed to dismissing it and rooting that context itself as the root of mental illness? If that distinction makes sense, I hope that distinction makes sense. And so what Louis Mars would do from, I would say, around the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, is he would rewrite the Haitian nosology. He would rewrite mental health as we understand it in Haiti. He wrote La lutte contre la folie, for instance, talking about the way in which Western understandings of mental health diagnoses could not be placed and could not be diagnosed within the Haitian people. They were not meant, right? They were not meant for the Haitian people. He wrote The Story of the Zombie in Haiti, for instance. If anybody's heard, seen a zombie movie, seen the idea of zombies, right? The idea of the zombie, the monster, is rooted, comes from Haiti. Right? And the Western obsession with zombies is based in a Western demonization of Haitian culture. And so when he had even prominent African-American scholars like Zora Neale Hurston come and say, like, zombies are real in Haiti, right? Contributing to the mystification of Haitian people. He wrote, we have to allow Haitian people to define our own reality. The person that everybody's writing off as a zombie, the person that everybody thinks is some type of magical monster, is someone that I've found, I've interviewed, I've diagnosed. This person is struggling with aspects of psychosis, right? There's an elderly woman who's been homeless for a number of years and needed care, right? Not the bewilderment of the international community as you, right, invoke a level of mysticism on people that might be in need of care. And so what Louis Mars would do, right, from this, from his ethnocentric or ethno-psychiatric standpoint, would be to rewrite and reconsider how Vodou is key and essential to actually taking care of the Haitian people. When you look at, he would write about the necessity of something like possession. Possession was always kind of clearly linked as a one-to-one with schizophrenia and hallucinations and delusions. He would talk about the necessity and the need to see that, you know, possession in a certain context is a treatment. It's allowing people to inhabit different understandings of themselves, different understandings of their spiritual framework, and move through whatever problems that they might have. This is not in and of itself a mental health problem. You can't look at everything that you're saying that is bizarre to you as a mental health problem. And more than that, taking a step back, it contributed to like further analysis of Haitian Vodou and what were the unique things it was saying about personhood? What were the unique things it was saying about the mind? I want to be like very clear. Although I am Haitian on my father's side, I do not practice Haitian Vodou. I've done some reading, and so there are aspects, right, of the mind, like we typically root the idea of like a tripartite mind, for instance, within like a Freudian conception, right? The id, the ego, and the superego. You can look at Haitian Vodou and see, oh, there's a nuanced understanding of the mind here as well, right? The idea that everybody has like a ti bon ange, right? A spirit that lives within them, right? That needs to be, that is connected, to the body. The idea of the loa that connects and protects everybody's ti bon ange, right? Even that specific idea that the individual isn't the self, in isolation, but it has the protection of a specific loa, of a specific spiritual ancestor or protector overseeing the coordination of the mind. Right? Everybody has also like a gros bon ange, what's called like a big good angel, almost in a rough translation, which is the thing that allows people to move through the spiritual world, whether that be in dreams or in trances, So the ideas of the distinct parts of people's spirit that allows people to interact with one another, connects people to the larger spiritual framework, allows for a more nuanced understanding of when I see a possession, when I see somebody practicing, what are the aspects of mind and health that I'm interacting with? What are the aspects of mind and health that I'm discussing? There's also the ways, moving a little bit outside of specific psychology and psychiatric practice, that it enables a more robust and complex interweaving of personhood identity and history. When you look at the map of Vodou and the different spiritual nations that exist, you can almost tell the story of Haiti through Vodou, because it is not meant to be this is an important note, it's not meant to be a text or written, right, religion. There's nothing that there's no specific text that you can find and read to get all the how-to and where-tos and of Vodou. It lives with the people that practice it. And so when you look at the specific spiritual nations, you could see those descending from Benin or the Dahomey kingdom, right? Those tend to be the Rada spirits. The Rada spirits, are the Rada Loa, are the ones that are some of the most respected. You could see the Gede. The Gede spirits represent the ancestors, the people that have recently passed on, right? The one that you want to honor, the ones that you might have known in your everyday life. You could look at the Petuo Nation. Right? Sometimes people kind of throw that in the box of, oh, these are the more dangerous spirits, when they actually kind of more represent the spirits of like modern day Haiti post-revolution, as some people would say. Right? And some of those are rooted in the Nago, or present day Nigeria, some of the warrior spirits. There are Taino spirits, Taino Loa, that people respect and honor and worship. So you could tell the story, you could tell the map through all the distinct different Loa that exist within Haitian Vodou. And it also very seriously considers and interweaves the colonial idea of Catholicism. Some people root that in historical trauma, other people root it in further evolution. The idea that here's their religious framework that they use to try and colonize us, let's take it and make it our own, let's interweave it with what we have. And so there isn't this hard kind of idea, hard boundary that is formed between different ways of being. Instead, there is a dynamic process as people live, as people move through the world, of combining and sharing and allowing distinct cultural traditions and movements to guide people as they move through the world. And so I want to fast forward us, right? So a little bit Haitian history, a little bit of, right, how it developed into an ethno-psychiatry. Right? Louis Mars influenced several prominent Haitian psychiatrists that would come after him, like Jean-Philippe, Marc Douillon, Le Grand Bijou, who would go on to kind of continue this practice. And in the modern day, so this was somebody when Nahum initially had reached out to me, I actually recommended, oh, you should talk to Judy Blanc because she's one of the more influential people for me. Judy Blanc is one of the first people to kind of take what was that kind of like radical history, right, of considering Haitian Vodou within psychology, within mental health, and bring it forward to how can we use this radical and revolutionary history to continue our political project, because in a lot of ways, mental health is linked to the political situation that people find themselves in, right? And so she hosted, I believe, if not the first, one of the first festivals for Africana psychology within the Caribbean. She published on it in 2017, so I'm not sure if it was in 2016, but again, leveraged the ideas of Haitian Vodou, Haitian culture, to look at what are some of the existing forms of historical trauma? What are some of the existing ways in which colonialism still impacts our sense of self and sense of identity? And how can we as psychologists and mental health practitioners, how can we combat that? Is it through politics? Is it through idea of like French reparations? What is the mechanism that we need to do to heal aspects of the historical trauma? And furthermore, when looking at the influence of this ethnopsychiatry of Haitian Vodou and mental health, you also have to shift somewhat from traditional, what I'll call Western psychology, to ideas of African-centered psychology. African-centered psychology was a movement started in the US in terms of the actual concept within the 70s, the idea that because again, like based on what we've talked about when it comes to Haiti, when you look at how mental health, when you look at how psychiatry is practiced for Black people, it is the theories and the ways of being and the ways of understanding health, they're not meant, right, for African descended people, right? If anything, they're meant to subjugate African-centered people or African descended people. And so there was a desire and a need to kind of construct theories that centered the personhood of people that over decades had been, right, made to be enslaved, had made to be oppressed, had been discriminated against. And so the field of African-centered psychology started in the US and expanded to, again, consider all the different ways of thought and being that existed in what I'll say like the global South throughout Africa that had been removed from how we understand mental health and well-being. And so when you look at African-centered psychology, you can see theories derived from Southern Africa, South Africa, some of the Zulu people. You can see theories derived from people within Zimbabwe, Somalia, and also within Haiti. Right? The idea of Haitian Vodou, that's kind of an advanced practice of what African-centered psychology started to do in terms of interlinking the distinct cultural traditions around health and well-being, right? And promoting an idea of what does it mean to be mentally well? What does it mean to be healthy? Haitian Vodou offering, here's what this looked like when people in pursuit of a revolutionary practice did this. And so there are some books by scholars like Edward Bynum, who looks at, in a very serious way, the connection between spirituality and mental health and considers Haitian Vodou in that sense. You could look at some of the work of somebody like a Wade Nobles, who similarly looks at Haitian Vodou as a revolutionary project and how it can be used to kind of complete what he says is the revolutionary project of Haiti in terms of unseating what is now neo-colonialism. And on the ground today, Haitian people are still leveraging Vodou in the political protests that exist right now. I believe it might have been last month, where during some of the protests around the current regime, people walked around the Capitol building, the presidential palace, like 7 times, asking their ancestors to help guide them in their political movement. So it's still a very salient and powerful force in how people not only understand themselves and their wellness, but also their political practice. To my end, I do work in I'm a member of the Association of Black Psychologists. I'm the Student Circle Chair of the Association of Black Psychologists, also the Sawubona Healing Circle co-chair. I'm not going to say the full story of the Sawubona Healing Circles, but they're kind of a diasporic first aid response to racial trauma. And one of the projects that we're working on is how can we conduct some of these diasporic virtual healing spaces for Haitian people, again, throughout the diaspora, moving through, again, another result of historical trauma as Haitian people on the ground are protesting for their political will and political freedom. Right? And so that's just some of the ways in which we're continuing to try to extend this effort of leveraging Haitian Vodou as a revolutionary practice, one that we understand is an act of genius, cultural genius, based in a history of significant trauma, and let it guide not just, let it guide the people towards a more healthy political, spiritual, and physical reality. Yeah, so I'll stop around there. I threw a lot out and hope we weaved it together somewhat, but this is where I get to be in conversation and clarify some things with everybody here. So please, if you have any questions, concerns, pull them out of the chat.
Yeah, of course, G, who's developing a project related to health. So please.
Hello, thank you for that. That was really interesting. At the moment, I am looking at mainly like gender issues and oppression, female oppression in the context of abortion, and basically how abortion, especially in the UK, is treated as a one-point medical thing, and there is hardly any support from a mental health point of view. So this is where I'm coming from, but I'm really interested in hearing whether you have like some practical examples in which you can challenge like Western ways of doing psychology by taking into account voodoo, especially like with your first point story of the person that you spoke to. Like, I was just really curious in finding out, you know, how could this person have been treated better, essentially. So I'm really, I'd like to hear some practical stuff.
Yeah, so it's a great question you asked. So I would say the biggest issue, well, I want to answer it in two ways. Like, one is the research exists, right? So the research around, maybe not specifically Haitian Vodou, but African-centered psychology, which again, like considers aspects of Haitian Vodou, has shown, you know, better mental health outcomes. You could look at someone like Linda James Myers, right, who you know, built a lot of her theory, some of her theory from, you know, analyzing Haiti and the spiritual traditions there. Look at her concept of an optimal worldview versus suboptimal worldview. Look at her therapeutic modality called like the belief systems analysis, and see in terms of like the mental health outcomes among, in this context, among Black people in the US, and see it has pronounced, right, positive effects in terms of buy-in, right, in terms of like not losing people. It happens a lot, right, in terms of people starting therapy or starting a psychiatric treatment and finding it's not for them, feeling not seen, and then like just, you know, just leaving, which again doesn't get captured in research. When you lose somebody, right, over time, you don't get to see like how it affects them over time. And so the research is there in terms of like the positive impact. The research on African-centered interventions for like non-Black, non-African peoples is severely lacking, I would say. I don't think there's like too much there, but again, in terms of like and I also want to, this is my fault, I'm going to take a step back because you asked about the story in place. There's also research, right, around specifically from people who want to decolonize and deinstitutionalize how we practice mental health, around better ways to treat people that have schizophrenia. That, again, in this case, we wouldn't even diagnose her with that, but better ways to conceive that as opposed to ways that introduce confinement. And so the issue, what I want to say is like, the issue is like, it's very clearly like the research is there. There are people who are doing that practically on the ground who have like very good outcomes. The issue is just like a numbers game. The issue is like a tradition of how we practice, right? The issue is a financial support to do this kind of work. But people are doing it and doing it effectively despite that. So yeah, if there's like a follow-up, I can answer a follow-up, but yeah, that's how I would think about that.
Thank you. Would you be able to type the name of the first person that you mentioned in the chat?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Kayla.
Hi. So do you know the work of, what was this? Resma Menakem?
Yes, I have his book like literally right. It's somewhere over here. Yeah, yes.
Okay, so I'm kind of thinking about it, this question through that lens of like ingrained trauma and how it and trauma responses. And well, actually, I guess I mostly I'm curious if you believe that spirituality and mental health, spiritual health and mental health are different, and or if like the spiritual aspect is like physiological, but something that is like understudied, I guess.
Yeah, so I would definitely say it's understudied because it's difficult to study through the current methods that we have, right? They're not meant to really. You can study aspects of spirituality, right? How people feel about their spirituality, right? And how those feelings about spirituality shift in their mental health outcomes. But studying the actual, if you're to take seriously, right, the spiritual frameworks people are operating from, it's not something you can do with the psychological, psychiatric assessment. And so what people try to do is, again, consider the frameworks as kind of like ontologically like true. Like you shift the ontology of a person from one that understands that framework as true, and then allow the treatments and the therapies, the understandings to extend from that. To the first part that you asked is if I see them as distinct. So the people that like Linda James Myers, like a Wade Nobles, that have built some of the theories, like a Resma Menakem, I'm sure, who build those theories, they understand them as inseparable. They don't see clear distinctions and delineations, right? They might impact the body itself, maybe in distinct ways, but understand people as what Wade Nobles would say is like as essentially spirit, beings. And so he defines spirit beings as distinct from like a spirituality sense. He sees that from like as an energy standpoint. We're made up of inherently like energy that could be influenced in different ways, and that a framework based in African-centered psychology that seeks to understand people more comprehensively, right, from a historical standpoint, noting, right, that trauma can be passed down through generations, it is more powerful at comprehensively understanding what people are experiencing and going through and passing on through generations. That makes sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to comment? Okay, David.
Well, I want to ask your advice. I'm interested in, okay, so background information. I've been an artist for 37 years. I was developing a program with an NGO that deals with transgender women living in jail. They are all concentrated in a jail here in Mexico City, all the LGBT community and people living with HIV. So the idea was develop a cultural program with them, but with the pandemic, all access were denied, and we were asked for credentials. So as an artist, I don't have any credentials right now. I am currently enrolled in a psychology program at university. In 4 years, I'll be able to have my credentials to continue this plan of working with this community. I would like to ask your advice in how offer or how, because I'm gonna get there eventually. This year, I think by December I'll be able to give some basic guided meditations and things like this. But really to offer therapy will be in like 4 years, in 4 years time. But in this meantime, I would like to ask your advice in which approach to take to this decolonization of therapy offered in jails, and like your experience with these people that has suffered trauma. Because from my very privileged point of view, I mean, this is how I'm trying to give something back to society and to my community, because I haven't suffered that trauma. But also I don't want to feel like, I mean, I want to ask your opinion because your case seems really intense. So like, what would be the right approach from my perspective?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to note, and this goes for everybody, right, is that you guys are like the kind of the creative masterminds, right? I could offer like some of how maybe it's looked in my experience, but I'm saying this to say I'm really looking forward to hopefully following like how your career goes and how your studies go, and seeing how you eventually tackle that problem, because it's the type of work that people desperately need and is not being done enough of. And so when you do that, I hope that you give the gift of that work to other people. And to the question, I can really relate. You know, we're not so far apart in our studies. Again, like I'm towards the end of the program, and so I was struggling with that. If you asked me this 2 years ago, I would have no idea, you know, how to begin answering that question, because I would be right facing a lot of the same questions. What I would say is like reading Frantz Fanon, reading some of the work around like from Cheryl Grills as well too, is first seeing that like mental health work, right, psychology work is not solely about like the individual that you're in front of. Like a lot of the time, these decolonial psychologists and psychiatrists, they have to engage with the political structures as well. There's so oftentimes so little you can do when you're going into a system and trying to almost mop up the blood as somebody's actively being, you know, harmed. You know, and that's often what prison therapy is. Right? That was heartbreaking for me, is talking to this person, right, doing an assessment. Thankfully, she eventually got parole, but you're doing therapy, trying to offer support to somebody in a context that is actively reproducing that harm, right? Actively undoing a lot of, and so that's part of what led Frantz Fanon initially to leave the hospital he was at in Algeria, right? Seeing that people were torturing, right? The Algerians coming to him for treatment and going out and doing the same exact thing, right? Is reproducing the harm. And so I would say the work has to engage on several levels. Right? It's not enough to just engage on the individual level. It has to engage in the political, socio-cultural level as well. And you don't need to be in the system at this point to do that, right? You can read up on what it's like, what the conditions are. I'm hoping people at that place have maybe left and told their stories. How can you support those? How can you elevate those? How can you contribute to the movements that they have going on, right? That's all a part of the psychology work. That's all part of the therapy, is taking apart the thing that is producing that harm. And also in like a very tangible way, it might not feel as meaningful, but anything sometimes, is better than nothing. When the pandemic hit, and a lot of the people I had been doing assessments with, again, like visitation got shut down. What we ended up doing was making an African-centered cultural guide to dealing with pandemic-related trauma, racial trauma, that we disseminated to all the people that we were representing and trying to get out of prison. And so things like that, like if they block your entry, is there a way that you can send messages, send mail that they might be able to read, that might be able to guide how they're meditating now, right? Instilling maybe an individual meditation practice, even though you can't be there to guide them through a group-related meditation at this point.
Thank you. Is it possible to share the titles that you mentioned, the text?
Yeah, for sure. Also, if it would be helpful, like I don't know if we can connect me over email with people, so I could just be sending stuff. Yeah.
That would be sweet. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also want to follow everything that people here are doing, because you guys are all superheroes. It's really cool.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ivan. Especially, I know that you're like super busy, but I'm sure that this is very important. Great. Anyone else? Anyone would like to share your research project with Ivan and have I don't know, a bit of a feedback or ideas? You're being
Got no friends here.
shy.
There we go, Kayla. Thank you very much. Kayla's my friend.
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, so mine is still a little bit in the weeds, but I think I actually don't know if I use that expression right. But anyways, so I'm working
sorry,
on.
Kayla, your camera is off.
Oh,
It would be nice to see you. Yes,
sorry.
it works.
Okay, I'm working on a procedure of community care for Indigenous peoples. A lot of people I'm connected with work within, well, I mean, we all exist in a colonial system, but I'm trying to think of ways that within a corporation where it's specifically, or where the systems of oppression are felt a little more deeply, especially within like the Canadian government. There's a lot of Indigenous people that work within the Canadian government. I'm trying to think of ways to like create a procedure of community care so that the Indigenous peoples can like kind of look after each other. And so I'm approaching it from like in my culture, we use the medicine wheel, which has it breaks it down into spiritual health, mental health, emotional health, and physical health. And though they're distinct in those categories, they're basically holistic still. Like you were explaining, that's why I was asking if you differentiated between the two. So they're like they're holistic, but at the same time have to be approached from different sections. So I'm just trying to navigate that to develop something that people can implement for themselves, I guess.
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you heard or reached out to SIP, the Society of Indian Psychologists?
No, I haven't. That
Yeah.
sounds like something I should do.
Yeah, no, so there's I think they're both in Canada, in the US, but maybe predominantly in the US. I just did an event with one of the student leaders there. And again, so much rich theory. I think that's one of the most difficult things doing this work is because, again, people aren't getting the book deals, people aren't getting the grants. A lot of the work that people does ends up getting erased, and you have a lot of people reproducing the same efforts. So the work that you're doing sounds amazing, and I feel like there might be people who can offer some of the maps that they've used among their communities as well.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge that I'm hitting is that, well, like I don't want to pan-indigenize, and while there's a lot of similar notions, I feel like healing is so individual, and so yeah, like yeah, trying to suss out whether or how to give people a space to take on that healing, but also at work. So
yeah. No, this is exciting. I'm excited. Oh man, what did everybody present these at the end of the class, or how does this work? I want to attend that. I want to see that.
Oh yeah, sure. We can invite you to the final show.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. It's happening soon. No pressure. Great. I think we are landing to the end of our conversation. So yeah, if it's okay for you, Evan, would you like to share your contact details on the chat?
Oh yeah, sure. So here's my email. Twitter. Yep. So either of those is fine.
Fantastic. So Ivan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. Wishing you all the best in that PhD. You know, it's happening.
Yeah. Say your prayers, please. We need all those.
We are. Fantastic. So hope to see you again for the final show.
Of course.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.